All right, folks, have we all caught our breath? Have we all gotten our coffee? Are we all re-energized after a jam-packed week of college football games? I know I have. It was a marathon for sure, but I was able to kind of get through it, and it's a good time to be in Big Ten country. Lots and lots of exciting football. I am James Neveau. He is Ken Davis. Ken, I told you before the show started that I watched parts of 15 different Big Ten games this week. What I did not tell you, I also watched a lot of non-Big Ten games, too. It was a feast of college football in the Neveau household. How'd you mark week one of the college football season?
Okay, wait, I'll get to my point. I need to know. I know there's multiple televisions going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I need to know the food and the beverage selection and how you go about it during all of these 20-odd games that you took in this past weekend.
So I try my best not to go like too heavy on snacks, trying to watch the girlish figure a little bit. I am usually give me a good meal at some point during like the later window of games. So like that 6-7 o'clock window, you get your, couple of burgers in you have, a nice, a water, just kind of replenish yourself. I went a little hard in the paint with Oktoberfest beers this weekend. The beer fridge took a bit of a hit. Did a glass or two of the Maker's Mark. Thank you, Mr. Davis. And yeah, they just kind of, it's all about pacing. You don't want to go too crazy. You don't want to get too full. You don't want to fall asleep. People love football naps. I don't do football naps. So I did not want to get too crazy on the food. So just a lot of like just meals and then like little nibbles of snacks here and there, like maybe some chips, maybe like a piece of fruit, like a banana or an orange or something. But usually I'm pretty good with that. The beer is like the one that's the one vice I will really allow myself during all these hours of college football viewing.
The vibes. We see one another a lot in a lot of different ways. I need to get my girlish figure together as close as you have the last couple of years. I need to drop some LBs. Now, for me, I think I got in Big Ten games. I think I at least saw 8 or 9, maybe. Man, some SEC games. I definitely saw parts of a few of those. Because also, of course, this is Big Ten country, but we want to kind of give you totality of how we see the playoffs and that some of the teams that we see may interfere with Big Ten teams and go against those programs. So it's one of those things, James, and I know you're going to get at me, and I'm going to be real patient because I know how slick you are. There are a lot of questions that I won't say were answered, but at least it seems like perhaps we may get the answer if some consistency, good and bad, continues to show itself moving forward throughout the beginning quarter of this Big Ten or just college football season.
I like that you phrased it that way because it does end up being a really good segue into what I think were the two most consequential games in the conference this weekend. I think that there were a lot of teams who just kind of had to go out and show that they weren't going to be, complete hogwash. They weren't going to be like a team that was going to kind of, go 4-8 or 6-6 or whatever. And a lot of teams handled their business. Like you had your Illinois that handled their business, for example. You had Wisconsin took care of Western Michigan. Like Maryland took care of business in a big way for sure. But I thought the games of most consequence and kind of the ones that you were referring to in terms of answering questions about what we can expect from these teams and just how high their ceilings can be in the 2024 season. I don't think there were two games that were more like in that zone than Penn State, West Virginia and USC LSU. And I mentioned this to you guys before yesterday's game. The Big Ten ended up going 17-1 this weekend. And I thought that they had some solid victories in the bunch. And I will say that both Penn State and USC, if you had to pick who made kind of the biggest statements in their victories, those two teams are definitely up there. And I think we should start with Penn State because that was the game. You and I both have kind of flirted with having them in our playoff field. We've kind of like said, if it's not going to be Ohio State, Oregon in the Big Ten title game, Penn State has as good a chance as anybody to get into that spot. I thought that the way that they handled everything that happened on Saturday, the weather delay, the weird kind of blitz looks that West Virginia was giving them, especially early in the game, I thought that Penn State did a really great job of addressing a lot of those types of questions. Can Drew Aller move the ball down the field? Can their defense withstand the losses of the guys that they lost up front in terms of their pass rush? Ken, I don't know about you, and we can get into these topics here, but I got to say, Penn State answered a lot of those questions in the affirmative, and I thought that West Virginia team that they beat, that was no like fluky thing where it's like, oh, West Virginia is just going to be really bad this year. I thought Penn State went into a hostile road environment and they controlled that game, and that is exactly what they needed to do. And it very well might be the most impressive victory of a Big Ten team this weekend.
Morgantown is an easy place to play, just like you just said. 4 words: Andy Kotelnicki and Drew Aller. I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier. You talked about some of those blitz looks that West Virginia was given. Not to say they wouldn't give him in general, but you're also giving that because it's a young quarterback and you kind of want to see what he can do in these situations. And it's early. So I'm sure James Franklin and definitely Tom Allen have been throwing a lot at Drew Aller because they figure not just West Virginia, but a lot of teams are going to try to confuse him, particularly when the ball is in his hands a lot more. Because last season we know, and not in a negative way, but they didn't want him to put them behind the 8 ball by turning over the ball, being a young, inexperienced quarterback. Listen, it's early. All right. But we're talking about a 50-yard pass, a 20-yard pass. All right. We're talking about almost the average of 20 yards per completion. Everybody, do you remember what we were talking about with this team last year and the fact that Manny Diaz had this defense pumping, but the offense was a question? And it wasn't just schemed up to a degree where you can just see where, and there's nothing wrong with things being schemed up, but sometimes you want your player, your baller, Drew Aller, to be pinpoint and throw the ball in situations that's advantageous for those receivers. And man, listen, I'm biased, and I know I use this word a lot. I saw something. I'm like that schoolgirl that I see that jock just come past, and then the hearts are in my eyes. That was Drew Aller, and James is like and of course we're dudes, but we're securing our heterosexual manhood, so we don't care. But James is like that friend that whops me with the notebook and is like, don't do it again. And like when we were talking just this past episode and James was like, yo, Drew Aller has to show it. James is right, because mine's is more of I hope and I wish compared to what we had seen. It's early, but we're beginning to see the tools. And we talked a lot last year about his arm strength and the ability for him to move out in the pocket. Talk times about him moving out a little bit more in the pocket. But Drew Aller showed a lot in that game, James. I was happy just to see what he did. Efficient game. It wasn't crazy, 11 of 17 for 206, 3 TDs. But, man, it was what we needed to see. And also, speaking of his wheels, 6 carries for 44 yards. And that, when James is talking about throwing different types of looks at him, he's also throwing different looks when you have to, perhaps. And I'm not saying he's a type of mobile quarterback where you have to keep a spy on him, but you have to pay attention. And you sometimes just can't sit there and play man if he's going to sit there and run up the backside of one of your defenders because they're manned up on one of the offensive players. So for me, shout out to James Franklin. Your point again, as far as these 2 games, because one, you're talking about Morgantown, and it wasn't that Penn State wasn't going to win. I don't know if either one of us took the spread on this game. I don't think I did. I'll say that much. I don't think I took the spread on this game. But this game and what USC, and I know we'll get to that, did really said something about perhaps what we may see in this upcoming Big Ten season, James.
We did not discuss spread in the game. We just both had picked Penn State. By the way, you ended up going 3-1-1 this weekend. North Carolina, Minnesota, unfortunately, was a push. North Carolina won by 2 points. So you got the edge because you picked them to win. I picked Minnesota. We both picked Penn State. We both picked Northwestern. You said no cover in the Michigan-Fresno State game. I said Michigan would cover. The spread was 21 points. Michigan won by 20. So you edged me out on that one. Woo! And then we both picked LSU, and we were both wrong in the USC game. So Ken Davis with the narrow week 1 victory. Congratulations to you, my friend. Just a very interesting betting slate for sure. But anyway, back to the Penn State game. I think that we both thought that it was going to be a close one. We thought that West Virginia would be able to kind of show those wrinkles on defense. And really what I was concerned with was whether or not Penn State's offensive line was going to be able to block well enough to keep Drew Allar up so that he could make those throws downfield so that he could potentially move around if he needed to. And by all accounts, I thought that Penn State did a really nice job of keeping Drew Allar upright, did not allow a single sack. There were 2 tackles for loss in the game by West Virginia, so they were occasionally getting some pressure on. But I thought that Drew Allar did a really nice job of flushing out of the pocket and getting moving when he needed to. As you mentioned, he had the 6 carries for 43 yards. I thought that he had a couple of really nice runs in the game, but I also was just so impressed with the way that he allowed the routes to develop when he had the time to do it. There was no sort of, I got to get this ball out. I got to get this ball out. Like, he let the play develop if that was given to him. And if it wasn't, he improvised. And I thought that that was such a critical moment of development for him to be able to have the pocket poised to deliver the passes that he did. And I have to give a lot of credit to the way the Penn State receivers were getting open in that game. I thought that Harrison Wallace had a fantastic game. He had 5 catches. He had a 50-yard touchdown catch. Really great stuff. And then you also had Amari Evans, who had a 55-yard catch in the game as well. So lots of big plays by that Penn State offense. Really loved the way their pass catchers were getting open. Then, lest we forget, Nick Singleton, he rushed for 115 yards. Like, he had a really nice day himself. And so we kind of saw everything that we thought that Penn State's offense could potentially do. You saw Drew Allar use the arm. More importantly to me, you saw him use the brain, and that versatility to be able to either run the ball when needed or to stay in that pocket and deliver what I thought were really precise passes. Drew Allar's decision-making on Saturday was fantastic. And if we're going to see that from Penn State this season, there's going to be a lot of teams in the Big Ten that are going to be on notice, because I think that the Nittany Lions made themselves an offensive statement on Saturday.
And they're multifaceted if this continues to go along. I think the thing that could hurt them may be, for instance, like playing Ohio State with the defensive backfield. Then we'd have to see the difference between the amount of separation that those receivers perhaps can get. And I'm not saying that would happen. I don't know. But we have to also look at some of these teams that are armed up to the T, like Ohio State, particularly on both sides of the ball. But the point that I'm really trying to get at, when you're talking about a Penn State team that was basically efficient from 12 yards in, and I'm giving them 2 yards last year, perhaps 3 yards.
Yeah.
And now you're talking about 50 burgers as far as passes. I mean, we don't have to say touchdowns, but just if you're able to exploit that on the outside. You mentioned Nick Singleton. Katron Allen really didn't have to do too much, but then you add in Drew Allar, and now in games where perhaps they're bogged down, the play action is going to be even crazier, because you got 3 guys who can get out and move the ball around in those 2 the running backs and also your quarterback. And if you have those receivers on the outside, it may be hard. And we have to see it still. We have to see it. But man, right now, looking at it, and you're talking about what, like the next 4 games at home, I think, until like October. And one thing too, and I know we would talk about it, but it's not like a situation where one of those teams are coming into Happy Valley, but it's like we're talking about Morgantown. Happy Valley is not the type of place that you want to carry your ass and play at either. So like this could really set up Penn State to where we're looking at them, and I'm not saying it's early, so let us just enjoy ourselves. I'm not saying that we've talked a lot about perhaps backing in, and not disrespectfully backing in, but perhaps they didn't have to reach the heights that the 2 teams before in the past, Big Ten and Ohio State and Michigan, perhaps they didn't have to reach those heights to still get into the playoffs. They may be able to kind of look at those teams, well, particularly let's say Ohio State right now. They may be able to kind of look at Ohio State eye to eye a lot better than perhaps we thought prior to the season commencing.
Well, we definitely are going to have a few different opportunities, I think, for teams to make a little bit of a push against Penn State right now. I think that we're going to get into the USC game here in a little bit, but that trip to SoCal in October looking very interesting for a Penn State now. And you also still do have Maryland rolling in. And like I had mentioned off the top of the show, Maryland had a really solid win during this weekend. I think they put up a 50 burger in their game too. So clearly the Talia Tagovailoa absence not doing too much to Maryland at this point. But I think that sticking with Penn State here, I also wanted to give a lot of credit to the way their defense played, Ken, because you and I talked a lot about that defense and whether or not they'd be able to get ample pressure on the quarterback. We were really questioning whether or not their secondary was going to be able to do what it did last year, losing their top three defensive backs. I thought that was going to be a hugely telling thing for them. All they did was, defend 5 passes. All they did was hold Garrett Green, who had 13 rushing touchdowns last season as a quarterback. They just held him to 5 yards on 10 carries. No big deal. Like, they kept him so bottled up. They did not let him scramble at all in that game. And the commentators kept bringing it up, and rightfully so, that to me was the story. Like, Garrett Green would try to get out of the pocket a little bit, and he was just getting swarmed by levels of defense by Penn State. They just kept coming at him throughout that game. And yeah, they're going to face some tests later with their secondary. They're going to face some really solid quarterbacks coming up at different points later this season. But in terms of being able to contain a mobile quarterback and to really force an offense to be kind of one-dimensional, boy, howdy, did they take West Virginia's playbook and just rip it to shreds. I thought that was a phenomenal job by Tom Allen and company in his first game as the DC at Penn State. I thought that they acquitted themselves very well on Saturday.
It also speaks to a level of football IQ when you're talking about the players also, because you look at Abdul Carter, and it's not like he flashed statistic-wise. He had a tackle. But the point that you're making as far as the commentators, you're really talking about maintaining the edge when you're talking about having a mobile guy behind center like that. And you have, like, if you played any sport, but just football at any level, the easiest part is to just go after the quarterback. Like, if somebody tells you, hey, you have no responsibility, just go after the quarterback. It's like Christmas, right? But when someone tells you, listen, don't even rush upfield as much. You have to stay at a certain level when you're rushing upfield to contain the quarterback so he doesn't get out or get around you. And you're pumped up, you're angry, you're ready to go. You're trying to get past an offensive lineman or a tackle or a defensive back. I mean, a running back. I meant to say a tight end, not a tackle. It just shows how smart. And you talked about the players in the secondary that left, the 3 players last year, but it also speaks to the depth in the backfield because you're still setting those guys up to maintain on the defensive side to make sure that quarterback doesn't get out. I'm interested to see how this defense plays down the line. I think just in general, historically, they're a pretty good defensive team. So I felt like even when we were talking last week about this team, I felt like it would carry over just because of kind of how the program is run. And I know Manny Diaz is we know he's at Duke. He's a special coordinator and a head coach when it comes to defense. But yeah, to see on both sides of the ball what Penn State does, I have to see it. I like you mentioned SC, and I don't want to dive too deep into a game in next month, but I think that's going to be something where offensively we can really see on both sides of the ball with Penn State. Defensively, can you stop a Lincoln Riley offense? We have to wait to see what SC and Miller Moss is doing then. But can you stop that offense on that side? But also defensively, that's what I'm saying. But also offensively, if you have to score against the Lincoln Riley offense, and we talked a lot about, can you run it up to 30? That's what Penn State kind of showed us in this game, that if you want to run it up to 30, we got the tools and we got the weapons, and our young quarterback, we will give him the ball and allow him to run it up to 30. But defensively, you're right. They had a really nice game, and they totally ripped up the playbook that West Virginia was running offensive-wise.
I did want to ask you about Abdul Carter specifically, because you did mention that he only had 1 tackle in the game, but I certainly saw him a lot more often than that. When you're watching the game, you see the flashes of him popping into gaps and preventing Garrett Green from escaping the pocket, really preventing the run game from getting anything really going in that game. I did also see him dropping into pass coverage more than once in that game. So I'm wondering if maybe they're going to kind of continue to, I know he's like ostensibly an edge rusher, a defensive end, whatever you want to call him. They still seem like they're having him do linebackery things occasionally. Do you think that's going to be something that you're just going to kind of see to kind of keep offenses off guard, because they're not going to be able to just say, well, we're going to double team Abdul Carter and that's just going to be the way that it is? He starts, going back into pass coverage. It's like, oh crap, all of our blocking assignments just kind of went out the window. I think that's something that we could really see from Tom Allen too. He really seems like he's he's using Abdul Carter in a lot of really interesting ways. And I think we're going to keep seeing that moving forward.
But and I know he's going down. He's a down lineman. That's what he's going to do. We look at Adisa leaving. We look at my guy. I don't know why I'm blanking on. What was the other defensive end, James?
Adisa Isaac and Chop Robinson.
Thank you, Chop. I was about to say Chubb. Yeah. Chop Robinson. And thinking that when you had a guy that was playing linebacker, now perhaps coverage isn't Abdul Carter's forte to say, but if you have a defensive end that can play back in the zone and in coverage, and you said it, I'm just piggybacking what you said, it blows off your blocking schemes, because initially when the center or whoever, and they're like, well, here's the mic or whatever, we think the heat's coming from over here, but then he backs off into a zone, and then you can have a cornerback, a safety, or whoever come, like it throws you off from what you expect. And then it also benefits him from times when he's coming and you don't think he's coming. So, yeah, for me, I always thought you should use him as a hybrid role. We've talked about it. And, again, it's low-hanging fruit. The Micah Parsons part, where it's been a lot of times I've asked people in the NFL with under center when we've had Dallas reporters on, would it benefit him to play in one role? And they've corrected me and be like, no, you should take advantage of both. And they're right. When you have a player, and I think also we grew up in this is what you do type of world, right? Mm-hmm. Like, for instance, I grew up living hip hop. And back when we were children, and then I'm older than you really didn't sing. And now it's kind of like you can do more. And I'm meaning that like more in Shohei Ohtani, where, you can hit, but you can't pitch. You can't do both. And it's like, no, if you're versatile enough, which we know Abdul Carter is, that doesn't mean you overuse him during passing routes. Now, if someone maybe get hurt, he may have to pop back into more of a linebacker role, but it also gives you versatility with what he can do and availability if he can do that. So I think I like the point where you mentioned, and that's why I was kind of lean towards when I said statistically he didn't have a great game, but you mentioned the gaps he was filling, and you're sending people to the right way. Sometimes it's a lot more than what shows up on the box score and the stat sheet. It's about funneling and helping out other teammates in the scheme to make sure they can't do something outside of you just having key great plays like sacks and TFLs and stuff like that.
Yeah. We also had another guy that we talked about quite a bit before the season started was Danny Dennis Sutton. And I thought that having those two guys on the edges was going to be really impactful, not just for them, but also potentially for the defensive tackles too. And I thought a guy who just jumped off the screen throughout that game was Zane Durant. Had multiple tackles for loss in the game up the middle, was really disrupting, really overmatching the guards for West Virginia. I thought that the way that he played, man, that's going to allow guys like frickin' Carter to just pin their ears back and go after the quarterback. If you've got him wrecking shop in the middle of that line, those defensive ends are going to eat this season, man. Like, that was something really fun to watch, and I really loved watching those guys play, and I'm glad that their stat lines reflected it. So before we move on to the other game, I really wanted to give the flowers to the middle of that Penn State defensive line too. I thought that entire group did really well.
Listen, there's nothing faster than a straight line. And if you have a disruptive DTs, it's going to make the game easier for the guys that you just said on the edge. But also having those guys on the edge is going to make it easier for those DTs, because you have to pick your poison. Which way are you shifting that line? Who are you doubling? And sooner or later, those two ends are going to pop too. So like that's what, and also it allows you now to scheme up what you want to do, because you know how you can occupy their offensive line with 4. You know, if you're just sitting like so they got 5, you have 4 now, and if we can get to you with 4, it's going to be a problem. So yeah, great game defensively. Definitely shout out to that team and those players. Let me see, defensive coordinator Tom Allen, which blanking on Tom Allen's name. Tom Allen coming over. Shout out to Tom Allen. He had a great game, and he had some decent sized shoes to fill, and he kind of showed us he may be able to definitely fill Manny Diaz's shoes as a defensive coordinator for the Nittany Lions.
You get the sense that if they continue to play like that, I'm betting there are going to be some teams giving him a call after the season to potentially jump back into head coaching. And I'm curious to see if he'll end up jumping ship. But hey, we've already seen what happened with Manny Diaz. You do a good job at Penn State, you get a pretty high-profile job. So we will see what ends up happening with that. Again, kudos to Penn State. Really great job. All right, Ken, the other game that we really wanted to talk about, like we'll give out some, little tidbits of praise or whatever for other games later.
James said, let's get to the real.
Let me tell you something. the game that I think everybody was most looking forward to, and the game that honestly to me lived up to the hype and may have been my favorite game I watched all weekend long, USC and LSU on Sunday night in Las Vegas. First of all, Baton Rouge West, that crowd was heavily LSU focused, and the Trojans went in there against a team that is really highly touted. They're ranked number 13 in the country for a reason. And their offense did not look like they blinked at all. They were finding open seams everywhere on that field last night. Miller Moss, 6 touchdowns in the bowl game, only threw 1 touchdown in this game, but he threw for 378 yards and just looked like he was so poised in that pocket. USC's got some incredible wide receivers we're going to talk about who made just some absolutely bonkers plays during that game. I got to tell you, Ken, I had a thought that they were going to get blown out last night. Like, I really thought that USC and Lincoln Riley was going to be like, okay, y'all think that you can, go post, Caleb Williams and just go out there and keep rolling. LSU is going to humble you real quick. That's what the SEC does. No, sir. USC went out there. They won that game. They had some great defensive moments. And more importantly to me, a myriad of offensive weapons that they showed out, and Miller Moss was chief among those for me.
1/3 consecutive open season loss for Brian Kelly. And I'll tell you this, I know, and I'm sure some of us Midwesterners are even more like what James has just made the crying. He just mean crying.
I'm gonna smack the table, Ken. That's what he did last night. He was furious.
But it's funny. With LSU, they're going to have talent, but you never know what you're going to get. And I'm not saying that they're not out the playoffs, but it's one of those things like I'm going with, you know what? I'm looking at the rankings, and I'm just being honest. This is a kind of a weakness, flaw for this game. I'm looking at the rankings, and I'm like, okay, they're 13. You know what? Last year I wasn't keyed in as much. I mean, I definitely do the SEC, but I've been with you, so I'm not in my SEC as much. But I'm watching more what Kirby's doing. Definitely Nick Saban. I'm looking, and I know they weren't in the SEC then, but still, when you're talking about Texas, Missouri, all of that is where my focus is usually, and even in the SEC when we're talking about Florida State. But the thing is, and you mentioned it, Miller Moss. Whoa, the young man definitely showed what he can do, and he took Lincoln Riley's offense and did exactly what he needed to do and showed us there may be no skips. Actually, I won't even say that as far as no skips. Actually showed us this offense, and you mentioned why. It's probably going to be more proficient than last season because of the talent on the outside. You mentioned, and you had us going in the chat about Kyron Hudson, and I know we're going to talk heavy. There's a couple receivers we're going to get into today, but there was a lot of old Odell Beckham Jr. stuff going on in college football with one-hand catches that were crazy and interceptions that were crazy. And Zachariah Branch also had a good game. Lake McRee had a good game. Jacoby Lane had a good
he made some plays, dude. Ooh, man.
The ball was passed around like a sampler. All right. Like all these guys, and this, let's say this, out of when we're talking about West Virginia, no disrespect to West Virginia, but we're talking about a top 15 team where one thing we do know, all right, when you're talking about LSU, and it may not be as a whole unit, there's going to be talent on that defensive side. We know that probably somewhere on the line is going to be some talent. Definitely them DBs are going to be talented. Definitely probably those wide receivers are going to be talented. And you went to, and you mentioned you went to the Legion in Vegas, and it was 60% Tigers up in that bad boy, which I think most of us could expect, because who doesn't like a quick trip to Vegas to open up the season with your favorite college program?
Yeah.
But have that pressure on you from Lincoln Riley, as you alluded to, knowing Caleb is gone, and people have been questioning you, and there's some people that are taking it to a level of maybe you're not who you're supposed to be when the USC brought you in from Oklahoma, and you showed them that last year was a fluke, which can happen in recruiting and going into a new program where you're bringing in players to fit your scheme. But also, let me say this, James, and I think we'll talk about this later on in the year. you're also starting to bring in players that maybe fit in the conference that you're going into the following season. Because if you're smart, you want those freshmen to be sophomores when you're knowing that you're going to go into the Big Ten and necessarily won't be playing the exact same style of football offensively and defensively on the in the Pac-12. And then, of course, when you have DeAnton Lynn, they may have not got there with sacks, but they got there with pressure.
Sure did.
It was schemed up. But offensively, look, hat off to Lincoln Riley. Also, hat off to Garrett Nussmeier. 29-38, 301, 2 TDs and an interception. I mean, these quarterbacks were going at it. It was your turn, my turn, your turn, my turn. So, and that speaks to one. Let me give Garrett his props, but also speaks to Miller Moss stepping into the situation where that's a lot of pressure, and you're coming behind Caleb Williams. You're going up against a guy that can be a Heisman favorite in Garrett Nussmeier, and you're in Las Vegas. It's a Sunday night game. You're playing on Sunday night to open the season. So they showed a lot. It'll be interesting to see if definitely they can continue. But man, I know they got Utah State next, and that's like a battering ram as far as how hard that they play and how grueling that they play. But that was a nice first game against a really good team that most of us had them losing against versus the LSU Tigers.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like Vegas had them getting blown out. It was only a 4-point spread. So it's not like there was like a huge amount of like, oh, well, this is clearly going to be, LSU blowing the doors off them. But I think out of all the scenarios, like other than a close game, LSU blowout probably would have been a little bit more where I would have gone with it. But I thought what stood out to me, both sides of this, was just the way the defenses tightened up as soon as the offense got into the red zone. Between the 20s last night, it was wide open. Everything was happening. Once you got inside the 20, the clamps came down from both of these defenses, and I thought they made some really nice plays in the red zone. It just so happened that USC was able to kind of withstand more of that and to make more plays, and Miller Moss was able to deliver the ball in those situations. And I thought that his bowl game last year, everybody remembers, he threw 6 touchdown passes in relief of Caleb Williams. Just kind of had that moment where he was like, hey, I've been here for a couple of years. This is going to be my time now. I got to ask you this, Ken, because we've seen it now a couple of times within college football this season where you're going to have guys who are going to be in that second fiddle role, and they're just going to be kind of biding their time and waiting. You're thinking of Dante Moore up in Oregon, for instance, Arch Manning in Texas. You're thinking of all the talented freshmen that Ohio State has that are going to be coming up through the pipeline. I wonder if maybe we start to see that a little bit more often with quarterbacks rather than jumping at the first available opportunity to get out of Dodge and to stick around for a year or two and then just be able to come in full guns blazing the way that Miller Moss has in the first 2 games that he's played in place of Caleb Williams. I know this is kind of a big picture question, Ken, but should we read into that maybe as perhaps a little bit of a changing trend for at least some quarterbacks to maybe say, hey, look, like I would love to start as a sophomore, but if push comes to shove and I have to wait till I'm a junior and I show out my junior year, that's going to look just fine to an NFL team. I think that might be maybe something we see a little bit more often at times, just based on what some of these guys like the Mannings and the Mosses of the world are doing.
I'm going to throw in 3 factors that play a huge part in that, James. One, it depends on, I would say, if particularly quarterback, how great your either coordinator or head coach is offensively, to where, even if I miss a couple years of playing, when I get a chance, even if I play 1 year, I can go to the pros. But if I get 2, I can go to the pros. I also would go with, for instance, you look at Alabama, and that's what you look at Mac Jones, you look at Jalen Hurts, you look at Tua Tagovailoa. You look at what's the last one? I don't know. I've been blanking on his name.
Jalen Milroe?
No.
Bryce Young.
Bryce Young. I've been blanking on Bryce Young for.
I was like, you're not blanking on Jalen Milroe. I had to.
No, I've been blanking on Bryce Young all week. All right. You look at Bryce Young, and the key thing is this too. I think one, it's on how, and I'm not saying this is like in a nefarious way, you sell that young player, because I think Nick Saban sold Bryce Young on the fact that you have a chance to beat out Mac Jones, but no one really thought Mac Jones was going to win because Mac Jones had been there and presented them with the best option to win a national championship than having a young player come in. And I think it's early enough. So when you look at like Malava with USC, it's early enough in his career where he can give up a season, maybe two, but a season to know that I have Lincoln Riley, and Lincoln Riley, we can go through Lincoln Riley's history of quarterbacks. You all know his history of quarterbacks. So why am I going to leave Lincoln Riley when I know that look at what he did with Jalen Hurts? Now, Jalen Hurts was down in Alabama, but look at the guys when you're talking about Baker and Kyler and all. Just give me a year and I can get you into the first round, if not at the top of the first round. So I think all of those kind of factor in where even though I want to go out there and show out, my family, my friends are like, I thought you were going to be playing. This behooves me to sit my ass down and wait because this man gets people paid. You know what I'm saying? Like, so it's one of those situations where it's like, I want to play, but I know what you can do for me. And also it may be the coach may be honest too with, you know what, this is what helps us right now. Think about this. Look at what happened with Caleb, right? Caleb was spitting at the bit. And then Caleb got in there and won the job, and he gave the job. Now, I'll tell you this. I don't think that's going to happen right now this season, but it's really early to jump to that part. But yeah, I think that was a nice observation by you and something for us to dive into because it is interesting. But I think it's really about the program and the offensive mind that can perhaps that can perhaps secure my future legacy plays a huge factor in that, James, in my opinion.
And I do have to say too that just as you mentioned, that list of quarterbacks that Lincoln Riley has coached to great success, I think that that's really going to play a huge impact in that. And then you have Ohio State, where you've got Ryan Day, who's had a history of turning out really great offensive talent. Now you've got Chip Kelly in the mix, who's an incredible coordinator. And so, man, sorry about that. It goes to show that that having that coaching can be hugely valuable. And you wonder why guys are surrounding themselves with so much talent on their coaching staffs. I mean, look at what Alabama keeps doing with the Lane Kiffins of the world, the Bill O'Briens of the world. That's a team, they're doing the exact same thing. And I think the guys are really resonating with that. And I think that's one way to kind of short circuit the transfer portal a little bit, is to make sure you've got that kind of continuity in place. And so I think it's worth having that discussion about Miller Moss. I do want to talk about a few of USC's wide receivers too, because I think that was kind of always the thing. It was going to be, all right, who's going to really kind of step forward and really, kind of take some pressure off of Miller Moss, give him places to throw the football. Again, they had guys last night. I think they had 8 or 9 different guys catch passes last night. And you had 4 guys who went for 50 yards and another who almost went for 50. They really spread the ball around. And when Miller Moss was throwing to guys like Kyron Hudson, who made a couple of just absolutely insane catches last night, you had Lake McCree and Jacoby Lane both had really strong games too. This is a USC team. They are just going to be a matchup nightmare for any secondary that they play. There isn't a secondary on their schedule right now that I'm like, oh yeah, they're going to be able to contain all of those different threats. They don't have to face Ohio State during the regular season. I think they probably are going to end up having the best secondary in the Big Ten. USC's got a tough schedule, but boy, howdy, the way they can spread the ball out and then run it, if they absolutely need to, they can definitely run the football with Woody Marks. I think this is a team that is going to be a matchup nightmare on offense. And I thought they showed out in a big way last night. And I got to say, I wasn't aware really of the depth of USC's skill at wide receiver. They've got a lot of really potent playmakers in that group.
I think so this is twofold for me. I'll get to what's latter in my mind, what you just said. I think one, we're in such a microwave society that when one season doesn't go as what we expect, we think that at a blue blood like SC and an offensive mind like Lincoln Riley, they wouldn't make sure where, okay, Jordan Addison is gone. Caleb had Jerry Rice's son with him last year, but really didn't have an allotment of great playmakers on the outside, that it was going to be difficult for them to bring in playmakers at one of the best places to play college football, weather-wise, opportunity-wise, in the University of Southern California, right? But I'll say something, and you hit on where I was going. there are going to be games where the passing game won't click, particularly because of weather that factors in. That could be wind, water, sleet, snow, whatever. Weather could be an off game. I still need to see what that offensive line does with opening up holes for the running game. But you made a great point. When you have that many passing weapons, it allows for holes to open up because you're really going to have to play with your defensive backs back. It's not like you're going to have 8 in the box. That safety, you're going to have 2 high safeties basically, because what are you going to do? You're going to forget. I apologize for saying that, James. I apologize. You're going to be a nickel, right? You're going to be playing a ton of nickel because it's going to be some dime, a lot of dime too.
Oh yeah.
So you're not going to have that many linebackers out there as far as stopping the run game. Now we do see a lot of these colleges, particularly not just the Big Ten, a lot of these colleges have rovers. They have that hybrid safety, cornerback, linebacker that kind of fits that role for those type of situations. But if they can run the ball, get into the points that you've made about the playmakers and what the kind of fear USC can put into the Big Ten this season, if Woody Marks and Quentin Joyner, if they can consistently run the ball this year, that offensive line can be stout. That's the real question. If they can be stout, man, again, we talked about this in the text thread. I feel like if they didn't have, I think they have one of the toughest schedules in the Big Ten this season. I feel like if they had the kind of schedule some of these other teams have, I think USC be putting fear in teams that was talking about making it to the playoffs. But I think they may have enough losses that they're not really going to have that chance, even though their strength of schedule will be ridiculous if some of those games flip and they win a couple of games that we think are going to be close, that perhaps they're a season too early to win those games. If they can win those games, they're going to be a scary team if they make it into the playoffs, man. Because if they make it to the playoffs, that means that regardless if it's through scheme or through talent, the defense played better, right? D'Anton Lynn's defense played better, and clearly either the run pass game complemented each other, or they just was passing the ball and nobody could stop them this year. And Lincoln Riley just had it all dialed up. But again, I think it's a season too early, and I think partially because of schedule. But man, they're showing us a lot, and these guys aren't really going anywhere. This isn't a situation now. It helps Miller Moss. Perhaps it depends. Like if he just has a crazy season, it may be time to go, young man, but it probably helps him if he's confident in himself that I can get my draft stock even higher if I remain here next year to play with this talent that they had come up that they're bringing up in here. But it was an eye-opening game, to say the least, when you're talking about what SC did against LSU.
Yeah, they've got kind of some weird wrinkles to their schedule. Like they have to play a game at Maryland in October, and then they have a home game against Rutgers on a Friday night. So they've got the short week flying back across the country. That's always going to be a strange one. The good news for USC, though, is that 2 of their 3 hardest games, arguably, they have left, Notre Dame and Penn State, are both in Los Angeles. That will be very helpful to them. Those teams have to come to them. Their hardest road games by a mile are Michigan, who we can talk about them a little bit, but it wasn't like they lit the world on fire on Saturday. Right. And then they also do have to go to Maryland, which I do think is going to be one of those kind of sneaky games because I feel like Maryland always plays well at home. They're always really tough to deal with. And so I think that that's going to be one definitely circle on the calendar. But I have to say, before we kind of move to the rest of the Big Ten and kind of give a little bit of plaudits and kudos here and there to other teams, man, USC really showed out. And I think that they made a really compelling argument that, like you said, they may not end up being a playoff team, but they're going to be on that next ladder rung down. Like, this is a program that I think is still really capable of recruiting really good players at key positions. And the way that Lincoln Riley has got his troops deployed out there right now at USC, got to give him a ton of credit, man. He is definitely doing what he needs to be doing with this team. They looked really good last night.
2 things for me. If Lincoln Riley, because he had a bad year after a good year, so that's going to make some people hesitant in that program. And you just mentioned it, dude. If they keep showing the potential and talent, the coffers will open up. This is SC. The coffers, they'll go from one of the team with good but not great NIL money to having some of the best NIL money available for players to come there. And my last point I want to say, James, and I know some traditionalists aren't going to like it, but man, what a day USC is in the Big Ten. That's crazy. The USC is here with us now moving forward from coast to coast. But I mean, Oregon is Oregon, but it's the modern day. But when you're talking about the jewel of those 4 teams, you could say USC, UCLA, but that basketball ain't been basketballing like it was about 15, 20 years ago, and definitely not since the Wooden era. But when you're talking about bringing, I don't care if it's a sleeping giant that's kind of awaking, USC to the Big Ten, it's a great day to be someone that watches Big Ten football with James Neveau and talks about it from time to time.
I appreciate the kind words, man. And it's crazy, like having to keep up with 18 teams now, but nobody I'd rather be doing it with than you, because you share my enthusiasm for projects that probably most sane people would not want to deal with. So I'm glad that you and I are going down this path together. All right. We have gotten through our 2 main games that we wanted to talk about. I do have a couple of nominees for Footballiest Thing of the Weekend that I do want to share with you, but before I do that, Ken, you and I both mentioned the number of Big Ten games we watched this week. Besides the 2 that we've talked about, what game to you kind of stood out the most in terms of what it told you about the team that was involved in it?
I don't want to do this.
I can go first if you want to have a moment.
No. It definitely, and you alluded to this as far as us getting to this team. It was Michigan, if I'm being honest, where it's still early and it's still a lot going on, and it's still a championship hangover. But like winning by 20 points, at home versus Fresno State. And Fresno State's one of those teams that offensively, but they can sneak in on you. I'm not saying like they're not just, you just don't run them over or whatever. But when you look at the score, the context makes you feel like it was a fist pump to the face of Fresno State. And the game didn't feel necessarily like it was like that. If you take the score away, you wouldn't necessarily feel like it was an overwhelming victory for Sherrone Moore in his first game as the head coach with no type of, suspension to Jim Harbaugh or anything on it. So that kind of 269 offensive yards. They only had 3 games under 300 yards last year. Again, it's early. But still, you want to see some of that stuff from last year transfer over into this year, but it's at the beginning of the season. So I would say for me, it was the national champions, but it still could just be it's early with a lot that's going on and the malaise from winning the national title and how many people left on the coaching staff and to go to the pros. But I'm waiting to see. I want Michigan to play well, but I'm definitely taking a wait and see approach to a certain degree, but I hope they play well.
So I thought that watching that game, because I watched that game pretty closely on Saturday night. It was that and Texas A&M Notre Dame were like kind of the 2 main games on the TV at that point. I was struck by the way they approached their quarterback situation, where Davis Warren got a lot of the time under center. Alex Orji was kind of in for more gadget plays, more run plays. I wonder if that continues. And I think this coming week when they play Texas, that's going to be a really key focal point, is what Michigan's going to do at quarterback for that football game. That I was interested in. And that one I'm like still very uncertain about it. I always feel like if you have 2 quarterbacks, you have none, if that makes sense. Like I don't like the constant interplay. Like I feel like you have a harder time getting into an offensive rhythm when you do that. And I get it. Like those guys can do different things. Michigan probably views that as their best opportunity to kind of throw opposing defenses off. But I think it maybe has an adverse impact on some of the players on your own team when you're doing that too. And so I'm kind of hoping Michigan settles onto one guy more often than not. And I would guess based on what they did on Saturday night, I think that probably will end up being Davis Warren, because it seemed like they had him more in for passing downs. The other thing that kind of concerned me a little bit was Michigan did rush for 148 yards. I did not see much from Donovan Edwards. That was and I know Kalel Mullings is an excellent running back at 92 yards. I thought he looked really good. I need to see more out of Donovan Edwards. Like when you lose a guy like Blake Corum, you have got to have a guy to kind of step up. And Edwards has been part of this program for quite a while now. That's a guy that I want to see more out of. And I wonder if we're going to see that during the season. Not a great first game for him. I thought that the offense, like my 2 big question marks were the quarterback position continues to be a question. And then I'm just curious how they're going to deploy the running backs and how they're going to run the football, because I got to see more out of Edwards if I'm really going to buy into Michigan as a potential playoff contender. I feel like he is such a key to everything. And yeah, we can talk about the offensive line. We certainly could talk about kind of the lack of receiving options that Michigan kind of deployed against Fresno State. I though wonder, maybe they played that one a little bit close to the chest because they knew they didn't need the passing game to beat Fresno State. Maybe that's a thing that Texas, we see them open the playbook up a little bit more.
Right.
But I think my biggest question coming out of that game is still going to be the quarterback position. And then running back, I am curious how much we're going to get out of Donovan Edwards. Like, those were the two biggest takeaways I had from the Michigan game.
I think one thing, and you've kind of like hinted about it, when you lose so many offensive players, JJ, Blake Corum, Roman Wilson, you need a Donovan Edwards who can be an explosive player to take advantage and help. Your guy, of course, you are the president of the Coast and Loveland fan club, 8 receptions, 87 yards, and a TD. Played well, and at least we did see that could still work, and he was spinning and bending, getting into that end zone. But I also think you hit on a key factor here. So I want to go back real quick to at USC. USC had to open that playbook up. Also, LSU had to open that playbook up.
They did.
You know, there were this is the big game. Like, if this was old, no playoff or 14 playoff, this is the season almost, right? Like, this is we're starting off back. So, but regardless, you don't want to go up, and you're trying to set a tone for these two programs that are heralded programs but aren't at the level they're supposed to be, still referring to SC and LSU. Now we're getting back to Michigan being, of course, a heralded program here within the Big Ten. You got Texas next week, right? And they're the odds-on favorite, and you don't want to show them jack, all right? And like, to your point, as far as trying to show what we're going to do on the outside, trying to show some of the motion that Michigan likes to kind of use to kind of figure out what you're doing or whatever, you know, even the offensive line alignments that they like to use when they go heavy, where it's like I'm gonna wait to, and again, they can lose. I'm not saying, well, I whatever, we'll get to that later on in the week. It's how the offense performs against a team that has national championships aspirations in Texas and all the money in the world. When we're talking about NIL and boosters and backers and all that comes with that. So I'll take a wait and see approach. If this offense is flatlining against Texas, and then I'll give it a quarter of the year, then there'll be some questions, but they still gave up a lot. And sometimes we just have to remember that. Like, a lot of the players that made Michigan the last couple of years what Michigan was, they're not there, let alone with the head coach. And it's not like Sharon Moore was just retained with the offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. We have to see, you know, the defense played well. Now you got another hardball family tree, the coordinator in Wink Martindale. But we kind of have to see how it works out, James. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm a hold off on blasting Michigan as far as offensively right now till the Texas game.
I will say that I will say that the Wolverines are a 7-point dog against Texas at home next week, and I'm wondering if that line's going to slip a little bit more into Texas's favor given the uncertainty that we saw with their offense. I have to say that there were two teams that I was really paying attention to this week in terms of their games that weren't kind of the main ones we were talking about. It was Ohio State, because I wanted to see kind of how Will Howard settled into that offense. Ended up throwing for 228 yards, 3 touchdowns. The Buckeyes did have 170 rushing yards. They finally got things going in the second half of that game. Jeremiah Smith, coming out party for him with 2 touchdown catches as a freshman. First freshman to catch 2 touchdown passes in his debut game for the Buckeyes since Michael Wiley in 1996, if you want to throw back there. I was impressed, not just with their offense, the way they kind of came back together. Definitely something we need to see more of. I want to see a little bit more out of Will Howard. I got to say, though, their defense was running roughshod over Akron that entire game. Their poor quarterback basically crawled off the field in the third quarter because Ohio State just kept hitting him time after time. Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau are terrors. Oh my gosh. They are going to be really difficult to stop. And then you add on top of that Ohio State has such a good secondary. this defense is going to carry them to some wins this season, Ken. And if their offense can be solid, you're going to have to look out for the Buckeyes for sure, dude.
This is all on Ryan Day. All right. For real. Because they have the allotment. There are only there. It's hard to say. Maybe Texas, right? There are not many teams with more talent than Ohio State on both sides of the ball. I mean, we've talked. Listen, as far as the extending the play, and as far as the DBs and the receivers, they're stacked and racked. But Gabe Powers with the pick six, Caleb Downs, the transfer, shout out, Roll Tide, half a sack, 5 sacks, and you should get 5 sacks against Akron, everybody. Let's also say that. But they had 10 tackles for loss. I'm in your backfield doing what the hell I like to do, when the hell I like to do. I'm stopping series like the dog. You getting tackled in the backfield like that, it's a wrap. We in 3rd and long, 2nd and long. You may as well start rolling this 10 up and going home. Yeah, man. When you're talking about both sides of the ball, and you mentioned JT and Jack, it's gonna be hard. It's gonna if Chip Kelly, I'm Chip, you do that running thing you do. This is gonna be a hard game if Ryan Day lets Will Howard, who had accurate passes yesterday too. Talking about,
yes, he did.
Definitely Jeremiah Smith had a game. You had Cardinal Tate. Emeka's gonna be Emeka. But Will Howard was he was hitting in windows yesterday too, in a great manner. Oh, I mean the other day, not yesterday. So if you can sit there and have the offense and the defense, but to your point, this defense showed us what it can be. I want to see it play against some more versatile defenses, or even offenses, or even offenses that are one-dimensional but are crazier in one dimension. So let's just hypothetically say, and I know they wouldn't play unless it was in the playoffs, but let's just say a team like USC. Let's say USC never got off on fully running the ball. It would be interesting to see. And again, they could perhaps do it with this defensive backfield and the pressure that they could show up front, talking about Ohio State's defense. But it'd be crazy to see them against what we think the receiving core is with SC. So like that's kind of, I want to see this team, Ohio State, on both sides of the ball stressed. That's what I really want to see. I want to see it I want to see it stressed offensively and see if Ryan Day gets out of his conservative ways. James, you said something and I left it alone. All right. I texted a little bit, but you talked about Marvin Harrison Jr., right? And you were talking about Jeremiah Smith. And I was just like, it's an old saying, the only person that could stop Michael Jordan was Dean Smith. And that last year, slightly, I felt like that about Ryan Day, because you still had Emeka. I know Emeka could have been banging. He had Emeka on the other side. You still had Travion Henson. You had a lot of weapons to still exploit the greatness of college. We'll see it in the pros of Marvin Harrison Jr. But now you have this the wide receiver. You have the running backs. You have everything. Just go out, Ohio State. I beg you, play like you're Ohio State. Put some respect on your own name. You are Ohio State, because the weapons are there. That's the crazy part. The weapons are all over the place, James.
Their big stretch is going to come up in October and into November, because they've got Iowa, Oregon, Nebraska, and Penn State all in a row. That is where they are going to make their biggest statement. And I think that the way the schedule is set up, you ramp up to that. You go into East Lansing. If you can beat Michigan State by a good amount, I think that's a great way to kind of go into those really key games. But I think that Ohio State looks like they're trending in the right direction. It looks like the things that they needed to make sure they polished up and worked on are being polished up and worked on. Still want to make sure their offensive line is up to snuff. You do need to keep Will Howard upright. You do need to be able to get Travion Henderson out there rushing the football. I think Ohio State showed a lot of that in this game, and I think that they acquitted themselves very well. We cannot end this podcast without giving some big props to the Iowa Hawkeyes. That is right. The Iowa Hawkeyes, who last season scored, I think it was like 4 or 5 touchdowns. So it wasn't that bad, but just literally it felt like every single game was like, how many times are they going to punt the ball and how many times are they going to put it in the end zone? Ken Davis, they scored 34 points in the second half against Illinois State. Cade McNamara threw 3 touchdowns. Caleb Johnson had 2 rushing touchdowns. Friggin' Reese Vanderzee had 66 receiving yards and 2 tutties. Dare I say, Iowa looked like a somewhat competent offense on Saturday.
I have to see it against a team that has more talent on it. And I don't mean to disrespect Illinois State. I have family members that graduated from Illinois State. But I have to see it against, you mentioned Ohio State. We know defensively they're going to be there. Mention of Iowa. Luke Lachey had a nice game too, with 6 receptions and 63 yards. Listen, if you can keep Cade up, definitely he looked good yesterday. I'm interested. I think they should be at least able to score in the low 20s, if not more. It just doesn't seem innate to them in some ways. But if they can get, we talked about this ad nauseum. If they can score, they're going to scare some teams within the country. That's just the truth of the matter when you're talking about Iowa. They're going to score. But the thing is, we never truly believe. And I'm not trying to diss Illinois State. It's just because Iowa has hurt us so much offensively. I'm still taking a wait and see approach against some of these better refined offensive teams and these juggernauts before I can. And the reason I'm saying offensive teams, and I know until we're talking about the defense of when I'm talking about Iowa, but I'm talking about what the offense of Iowa has to put up to catch those opposing offenses is why I keep mentioning that if I'm doing that, going about that in the wrong way. But that's the question. And also, you got to see this too with McNamara. He has to stay healthy. You know, he's basically missed 2 seasons. He has to stay healthy. Now, if I'm not even going to get into last year because we were both proponents of maybe he needs to sit out instead of pushing him early. But if they can keep him upright, okay, Iowa, let's see what you can do.
I absolutely agree with that. And I think that we were kind of hoping that they would get that test in their next game out. They do play Iowa State this week. The Cy-Hawk Trophy is going to be on the line. Iowa State, they only allowed 3 points to North Dakota over the weekend, but they also allowed almost 300 yards of offense against the Fighting Hawks. So not convinced that this is going to be a real strong test for Iowa. I do think that Iowa will win this game. I've not looked at a betting line for it. Would imagine they're going to be a modest favorite against the Cyclones. But look for that Minnesota game. I think Minnesota, they're going to be able to run the ball a little bit better. I think that's going to be a game. Perhaps we see a little bit more of a test for them, especially going up to Minneapolis to take on the Gophers. I think that's the one I've got circled for Iowa, but I think that that's going to be kind of when the rubber's going to start hitting the road for this Hawkeye team. But again, I have to give them a lot of credit for the way they played on Saturday. They took care of their business against Illinois State in a big way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, James.
So I mean, we could go on and on about different teams that made statements. We could talk about Dylan Raiola threw 2 touchdowns in his game this week. We are going to preview Nebraska will rematch against Colorado in Lincoln this week. Cannot wait for that game. We will be previewing that game this week. As we mentioned, we are going to have Michigan and Texas coming up this weekend. We've got Oregon, who's going to be taking on a Boise State team that they had their running back rush for 6 touchdowns this week in their victory. So that's going to be quite a test for an Oregon team that, frankly, didn't look that great against Idaho. Like, they had almost 500 yards of offense, but they only managed 24 points against the Vandals. And that was a game into the fourth quarter. They only had a 1-score lead. So definitely curious what that was all about with Oregon. I want to see the way they play against Boise State and the kind of the way they reacted. They maybe overlook Idaho. I don't really know, but that's going to be a game I'm definitely going to be keeping a really sharp eye on for sure. And then we have even a couple of Big Ten conference games this weekend too, including Michigan State and Maryland. So there's a lot of games that are to be coming up this weekend that are going to tell us quite a bit about some of the teams that are competing for kind of the bragging rights and jockeying for positioning within this conference.
Boise State 0-3. Oregon 0-3 versus Boise State.
That's weird. So weird.
It's the turf. But look, the thing too, I want to just real quick hit on the Oregon, and it's early. That almost 50 attempts by Dylan Gabriel. That's a lot.
That's a lot. And I will say Jordan James was banged up a little bit in that game. And so I think they maybe had to pass the ball a little bit more than they perhaps wanted to. But still, that is a lot of passing attempts against Idaho.
Yes.
And you had some good performances out there. Tez Johnson looked really good, of course, but man, I got to say, I'm not as confident that Oregon's just going to blow the doors off of Boise State as I would have been potentially last week. They gotta they're in that Penn State position right now where you got to go out there and prove it to me against what looks like a solid team.
Great point. I totally agree with you. So hopefully they will. Go ahead, James.
I was just going to say, we also shout out home state Illinois. They won 45-0. Luke Altmaier, really solid day, was able to get down to Champaign and see that. The one loss in the Big Ten, North Carolina defeats Minnesota. Max Brosmer had 166 passing yards. Marcus Major rushed for 73 yards. Just a couple of missed opportunities for Minnesota, and then obviously the missed field goal at the end of the game that would have given the Big Ten a perfect 18-0 week, and they missed it and screwed everything up. So the Gophers, the lone Big Ten team that did not win this weekend. And then and like I had mentioned earlier, Rutgers coming out of the gate with a 37-point win. Career high 165 rushing yards for my boy Kyle Monangai. Congratulations to that man. All right, Ken. But now that I've gotten it out of the way, now that I have praised my guy, Kyle Monangai, it is now time for the footballiest thing of the week. And I've got a couple of different nominees for you. And I need your verdict on this. Nominee number one, at the conclusion of the Fresno State-Michigan game, you had players kind of getting at each other in the hallway outside the locker rooms. Wasn't really any sort of punches thrown or anything. So just a lot of yelling. Fresno State Bulldogs have a sign on their locker room door that says, "Beware of dog." That, to me, is pretty college football-y, if I do say so myself. Texas State, who I believe we've talked about before, they've had some interesting moments as a program that we've profiled here on this show. At their home football stadium, they have a suite that is named Jobu's Lounge after Pedro Serrano's voodoo doll Jobu. And yes, there are Jobu dolls in this thing. So that's crazy. So the Jobu Lounge, the Beware of Dog sign, and then Northern Arizona, 66 points scored this week in their opening game. They have a lumberjack who cuts pieces of wood every single time they score a touchdown. I wonder how many trees they had to dissect during that game. And then finally, Oklahoma State prohibited Ken Davis from having QR codes on the back of their helmets for people to donate to their NIL fund. They were prohibited by the NCAA because you cannot have advertising on your helmet. So, Ken Davis, what is the footballiest thing of the week from those nominees?
Sorry, I gotta rank this because one of them doesn't matter. One, the QR code is definitely the most footballist thing if we're talking about modern football. That is getting to it. Like, listen, if we're playing, and we haven't even talked about the NCAA and the new rules that they dropped coming out. We'll get to that in the following weeks. But that's number one for sure. The wood is two. All right, save the trees. We got to find another way. I don't know about them damn Jobu dolls, James. I don't know how I feel about that down in Texas, for being honest, being a brother. Those are how I'm ranking those three right there. But the QR codes, oh my. Just first of all, so I can't do this throughout the game, right? Because trying to zoom in, this has to be a television type thing, perhaps, to really get a chance to get a good look at those QR codes. That right there is adapting. I shout out to adaption, all right? Being an adapter. So those are all really good and funny, James. Great job, great work.
I have to agree with you about the QR code. It just is like this perfect mix of Oklahoma State kind of being weirdly creative and a thing that do you really think folks are going to be pointing their phones at the TV set during games to take pictures of that to donate money? I don't know if they would or not, but apparently that is a thing that they thought people might do. I do have to say the Beware of Dogs sign on the inside of the locker room door for Fresno State that's pretty funny. I love that. That's you guys got to be dogs. You got to have that mentality. Right? That just to me is yep, that's college football in a nutshell for you. Just literally looking for any possible way to motivate anybody.
What if it was literal? We've seen Uga snap at a couple of people throughout the years down at Georgia.
Hey, he tried to go after the Texas Longhorn last week.
Exactly. So what if it was just also hey, also, but I'm with you. That was definitely football-y also.
All right, we'll have to let our listeners tell us what they think was the footballiest thing of the week. If we missed anything, definitely reach out to us. But obviously, we went over an hour in this podcast, a lot to get to. I told Ken, I think this is probably going to be the most Big Ten games we will have in a single week this season, because we do start to get into some conference action this coming week, and then you got bye weeks that'll kind of screw with everything. But great work consuming as much football as you did, Ken Davis. I know that it was a feast of a week for us too. I really enjoyed it and looking forward to more of the same next week. And like I said, our preview episode will be coming out soon for week 2. Tons of great games that we're going to get to. Ken and I are looking forward to that, and we will talk to you next time on Big Ten Country.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.